Let's talk about how to test your Next.js applications. For the past few years, I've had a ton of experience shipping Next.js applications to production, and a really important part of that job is making sure that the application is really tested and bug-free. I'm going to be telling you the two most important parts of testing your Next.js application, but if you really want to go into testing React and Next.js applications in depth, then be sure to check out my Testing React course at testingreact.catchfans.com, which is completely free and has a ton of value teaching you how to test production ready React applications. So this is the to-do application that we are going to be testing. It's basically going to fetch a list of all to-dos from the database and then display them on this list. I'm going to focus on the Next.js side of things. So I'll show you into the home index.tsx component, and basically this component it exports the main component and a get server-side props. Now this makes an API call with the SDK to fetch all the to-dos and then returns those as initial props for the component. Now if we check this component, it receives those initial props and then renders them to the page using a map. So this is the functionality we want to test. Now there's a couple of packages we need to install if we want to set up testing. So first, that would be Jest, which is our testing library or our testing framework, and we'll need to install types/jest because we are using TypeScript. Next, we would also want to install Jest, and this will be able to compile down our TS and TSX files and pass those for Jest to run. Finally, we want to install our testing lib/React, and this is a really helpful library that would help us test our components and actually interact with them to make sure that they display or render what we expect. So I have all of these installed to save us some time. The next thing we need is a Jest configuration file, and this has a preset of TSJest so that it uses TSJest, and the test environment should be set to JS DOM because we are going to be testing our components which are actually rendered in the DOM. Okay, so technically you cannot place your test in the pages folder because Next.js reads these files and transforms them into pages, and it becomes a little confusing when you try to force Next.js to know that some files are test. So I recommend creating a test folder in the next folder or at the root of your project, and then in here I would create a pages folder, and then I will try to make sure that my pages folder matches the structure of my initial pages folder right here. So here I'm going to have index.spec.csx, and that will match the index.csx page. So first thing I want to import here is React from React, just so we can render JSX with no problems. Next, I would import the home from the pages. So I would go into the pages folder and get the index file, and also the second most important thing I want to get from here is the get server-side props. Now these are the two bits that are really important in testing in your application. First, the function that handles the data fetching on the server side, and second, the component itself. Now if you were using something like get static props, then that's what you would be requiring to test. So in the index.spec we get the component itself and then the fetcher, in this case get server-side props. Next thing we want to do is set up our describe block, the home page, and our first test get server-side props returns the correct list of to-dos from the API. So this is very important. You want to make sure that your get server-side props correctly calls the API, fetches the to-dos, and returns those as props. And also in some situations here you might have conditions and say if not to-dos return a 404. In those situations you also want to make sure that you test those. So let's go to our index.spec.csx and actually write out this test. Now, a very important part of this test to remember is that you are going to test this function in isolation and this component in isolation, knowing that in production, Next.js is going to connect both of them together. So this function calls the SDK and fetches some data. So first of all, we do not want to be hitting the API and making API calls. So what we want to do is mock this SDK, and we're going to mock out only exactly what we need. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to import the SDK from GraphQL/client, and this would be anything in your application, an object, or something that helps you make API requests. So what I want to do now is jest.spy on SDK, and the specific function is the todos function, and that's the function that we are calling in our get server side props. And I'm spying on that so that I can track how many times it's called and if it's actually called. And also I'm going to mock the implementation of this function so that it's a fake call to the API and not the actual call. So here I would mock the implementation with an async function, and this is basically replacing the implementation of that function with my own fake function. Okay, so that it's not the actual todos function that hits the API, but my own fake function here. And this fake function is going to return todos and an array of todos. Now first I'm just going to define a test todos array, and I can type in this so that I know exactly what to provide. So I would say this should be of type todos query todos. All right, so in here I need to pass in an ID of 1 and a title of maybe learn view. That's the shape of a to do, and that's what our component is expecting as props. So I would pass this as the mock implementation. So anytime the sdk.todos function is called, then it's going to return this test todos as the response. So now I need to actually perform the action. All of this is called the preparation step for my test. Now I need to perform the action, which is to invoke the get server side props function. So I'm going to say constant response is equal to await get server side props, and of course I have to make this function async. And now the most important bit is remembering that the get server side props actually receives the context as an argument. And now I would pass in an empty object and cast this to any, because the context is not used in this scenario. But in a scenario where you wanted to maybe pass in a session, so let's say you wanted to test a situation where the user is authenticated, you can pass in a fixed session here and say user and ID 1. Whatever is going to be consumed in your context, then you can pass it in there. So for example, another example is maybe you wanted to test the page that displays a single to do. You would pass params ID of 1 here, knowing that it's going to be accessed in your get server side props. But in this case, our context is not being used. That's why I'm passing it as an empty object. Really important concept to remember. All right, so now after we invoke our get server side props, a very important test is to make sure that we expect that our sdk.todos was actually called. So expect sdk.todos to have been called. That way we make sure that we are always hitting the API in that get server side props function. And finally, we need to make sure that the props or the response that is returned from that get server side props function is exactly what we expect, because that's what is going into the component and the component is going to render it. So expect this to equal, and would expect this to be a props object with todos, and todos, which is going to be the test todos, like that. All right, so that's the completion of our test. And now, in case you're wondering why there's two todos, it's just GraphQL. This is the name of the query. This is the data in the query. Okay, so now we need to run this test. We're just going to do yarn jest or test, and I'm going to add the wash all flag. I can run test because in my package.json, I have that script already set up that just calls jest. All right, so I'll run this. Oh, I have to cd into the next directory before running that test. And we have a successful test. And this is good because the test is passing, but you have to make sure that your test is passing for the right reasons. Let's say, for example, this function is not returning the right thing and is actually returning a not found. If you run a test, you would notice that it fails, because now the props are not being returned correctly. Okay, so you just want to change something, make sure that your tests are actually passing for the right reasons and there are no hidden or false passes. All right, so the next test, which is most important for your Next.js applications, is the rendering of the component itself. So I'm going to add a new test here, which is it.only homepage renders initial todos correctly. because you want to make sure that your home page can receive the to-dos from get server-side props and actually render those on the page correctly. And this is where React testing library comes in, because we want to render the home page on the screen and then make sure that it actually contains the expected content for the user to see. So first I'm going to import render from testing library. And next, I need to have some fake to-dos that our API would return. So I would copy this. And next, I need to render those, or render that component. So I'm going to say constant is equal to render. I'll pass in home. And to home, I want to pass in some props, which is to-dos. And in here, I would have an object to-dos, which is going to be test underscore to-dos. Like this. So this render function is going to render the component in the DOM and give us a bunch of helpful functions that we can use to test. So we'll get by test ID. And if I go to that home component for 1 second, go down into the render, you will notice that every time I'm rendering a list item, I pass it this prop called data test ID, and it's going to dynamically generate a data test ID using the specific ID for that to do. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to my test and I'm going to add another to do here just so that it makes sense. So ID is going to be 2 and title is going to be master React. And just so you understand exactly what's going to be rendered, I'm going to call a function from this render called debug. So I'll call that function, and now if I run the test, you can see this is the output of what is rendered on the page. And if you can check here, you would see a list item for each to do that we passed in. So you can see data test ID is to do 1 and data test ID is to do 2. So this is the page that is rendered. What we want to do is make sure that the user can see the learn view and the master React inside the list items. So what we are going to do is loop through each to do. So test to dos dot for each to do. And we are going to get the to-do item from get by test ID, and we'll pass in the test ID, which is to-do, concatenated with to-do.id. And once we get that to-do item, we can expect the to-do item dot text content to contain the name like this. And now if we run our test, great, we have a successful test. But of course, we want to go into that component and make sure that for some reason, if we are no longer displaying the title, then our test is failing. So you can see it says it does not find this string. Okay, we put back the title, test runs, and we are good again. So these are the 2 important tests that you have to do for your components. There's also definitely the other tests that are actually the delete, the updates, or the create functionality, but these are not Next.js specific. So you would want to take my React course, which is absolutely free, by the way. And I'm just going to show you again one more time, testingreact.catchfans.com. Tons and tons of goodies in this course. This is the best React testing course I've ever seen on the internet. So do not hesitate to just subscribe and grab that for tons of knowledge. So just a recap of what we've done in any Next.js application. First, you want to set up Jest and testing library for your testing. Next, you want to import the component itself and the get server side props or get static props, and you want to unit test the get server side props to make sure that the data is fetched correctly from its source. And secondly, you want to test the component itself to make sure that it consumes the data that is going to be passed into that component at runtime effectively. All right, if you have any questions, please go ahead and comment below, and I'm going to be glad to help you out. And also you can tweet at me on Twitter for any specific questions or any specific tutorial requirements, and I would help you out. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next lesson.